Hey, welcome back to Transformational Tuesday. So glad that you've been able to join us. And as we meet each Tuesday, we talk about some part of mental health that we may be experiencing more so this time in our world than we have in the past. If you go back on Tuesdays, you'll find all kinds of ways to manage anxiety. Um, Learning how to ground yourself, learning ways to just have coping strategies that will help you deal with the everyday anxiety that you might be experiencing. Today, we are going to talk about grief, and that may be something that you may be aware of that you're experiencing, or it may be a feeling that you haven't been able to really identify what's going on, but you feel maybe a sense of heaviness, or you notice that you might feel sadness at times that seem to kind of pop up at random times. Or you may just notice that that there's just this sense of anger or irritation at times. And we know that grief can take on a lot of different faces, a lot of different emotions. And right now, the grief experts are calling what we're going through a collective grief or a communal grief, that it's something that all of us are experiencing in different ways. And so today, we're going to just talk about some real basic ways to kind of think about grief, and to be able to put a name to it, which we think is so important to do it when we're dealing with grief. And some of you may have remembered from a Psychology 101 class the stages of grief, and that was research done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in her stages, she identified different emotions that people may experience as they experience a loss. And she talks about going through kind of that denial phase of this isn't really happening, to anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And her work was never meant to say that these are linear stages that someone goes through, that you can put a check mark in the box when you're done denying, or you can put a check mark in the box when you're done feeling angry, or even reaching a place of acceptance. Because we know with loss that you're going to feel a variety of emotions throughout any given minute, hour, day, weeks, months, and years to come. And so I often, in my work as a counselor, I'll use what we call the ball of grief, which in a sense gives permission and ways to acknowledge and identify different emotions you may experience when it comes to grief. And we're going to put that up on the screen right now so you can kind of see those different emotions. And as you can identify on that ball, that there are lots and lots of emotions that one may experience. And that may sometimes help you to identify and put a name to what you might be experiencing. So hopefully that ball of emotions helps you to identify and validate, even acknowledge grief that you might be experiencing. So we also know that during this time of grief that we are experiencing each other's grief, that we're kind of witnessing each other's grief. And what we have seen sometimes is that people's grief looks different. It's unique. Grief in general is a unique journey for each individual. If you've ever experienced the death of a loved one, you may wonder why other family members may or may not be feeling the same way you are. And often we want to judge that other person, that maybe that grief, that person didn't mean as much to them, or that their relationship didn't mean as much. So we want to remember that grief is a unique journey for each person, and we all grieve differently. So even in a time where we have this collective or communal grief, people are going to experience that differently. And so I think it's important to be able to identify first your own grief and how you're experiencing that grief, and to be able to identify it, to be able to give space to that grief. Kind of there's a little line that says emotion needs motion. And so rather than suppressing that emotion, to be able to allow that emotion to express itself in ways that it needs to. I had to laugh as I was preparing for this. I found myself over the weekend reading just a fiction book, and as I was reading, all of a sudden I started crying, and I thought, this is kind of odd. Why am I crying? And I realized it tapped into some of the grief I was experiencing around everything that is going on in today's world. And so rather than trying to push it all down and think, oh, that's silly, I just kind of allowed myself to cry and to recognize that that emotion needed to be expressed in that moment. So give yourselves permission to grieve, to express those emotions as you need to. So often, just in general with grief, we tend to want a quick fix. And if you've ever experienced the loss of a loved one, you recognize pretty quickly that there's no quick fixes when it comes to grief. And in this journey that we're all on together now, as we are saying goodbye to the normal, that what we thought we knew in our everyday to be normal is no longer there. And we may be experiencing that loss in big ways or in small ways. I think about those that just the everyday kind of losses that we're going through. I have to laugh. I used to have a very set morning routine that involved going to the gym, involved eating breakfast and having quiet time at a particular restaurant. And obviously none of those things happen anymore. And I find myself at times really grieving that loss. I think of others that may have loved ones that may have passed, not necessarily even from the virus, but may have lost someone to death in the last couple of months, where maybe you haven't had the opportunity to say goodbye to that person. You haven't been able to be at the bedside when they were sick. And that, in a sense, brings a complication to that grief as to what we normally do when someone dies, that we want to mark that occasion. And so for those that may experience that, have experienced that, or may experience that, so important to make sure you are remembering that person in some way. Some of the grief experts have said that they would have never ever suggested virtual ceremonies as a way to mark a person's life, or to have people experience, to have that experience, to have grief expressed in some way. But by all means, they're suggesting now virtual funerals and memorial services for that very purpose, because in the moment you are experiencing that grief, and it's so important to know that you can share that with others and people can share that with you. One of the other things about grief that we want to make sure we think about is trying to stay in the moment with that grief. To try to avoid kind of the anticipatory grief, where we kind of look into the future and begin kind of the what ifs. But instead being able to kind of stay in the moment, to be able to stay grounded, and focus on the grief that you're experiencing with those losses today, and also being able then to look for those things that you may have control over in today. We've talked about that in a couple of the other Transformation Tuesday videos, that, trying to stay present in the moment, look for those things in which you have control of today. Because if we don't find those things that we have control of, we begin to feel really helpless, and we can even feel helpless in our own grief. And so if that means saying to yourself, I know if I go out, I can stay 6 feet away from a person, or I can wear a mask, or I can pick up the phone and call someone today. So looking for those ways of recognizing that you have control over something. I was going to put my winter clothes away this weekend until it got cold again. And so I realized, well, I'm not going to have control quite over that yet. I'm going to have to wait until it really warms up here in Cincinnati. The other place that I want to really encourage, as you just think about this grief that you have of letting go or saying goodbye to the normal life, normal world that we know it, as we have known it, is to have compassion for yourself and have compassion for others. I think it's so important to be able to give yourself that space again, to be able to be kind and to slow it down, kind of as I gave that example of being able to stay in the present and to be able to allow those emotions to come rather than judging yourself for a particular emotion that might arise. Just to allow yourself to have compassion, to accept yourself that that's part of your journey right now, and allow yourself to be kind and be compassionate to yourself, and also to be kind and compassionate to one another. Again, remember, we don't grieve in the same way. I recently had a parent tell me how much she was able to have compassion and validate the losses that her children were experiencing by not being in school, by not being with their friends, missing out on some of those end of the year activities. But to really validate for your children and those around you that what they're feeling is okay, that this is part of the journey of grief, and allow them to experience that grief. I had someone tell me that they were going to be graduating with a master's degree, and a loved one said to them, and the person was disappointed that there wasn't going to be a graduation ceremony, that they had worked so hard of achieving this goal. And someone in their life had said to them, well, you already had 2 other graduations from high school and college. That's not about being compassionate to one another. We need to look for those ways to acknowledge the sadness and the disappointment that people are experiencing, because there are all kinds of life markers that happen in life that we typically celebrate with one another together, and many of those are being canceled or delayed. And so, spend some time hitting the pause button and thinking about what are those things in your life, but also what are those things in other people's lives that they may not get to celebrate, that they were looking forward to celebrating. So, my encouragement to you today is to pause, to allow yourself to identify, acknowledge the grief that you're experiencing and that the others are experiencing around you, and having that compassion, giving yourself that space to be able to truly identify and grieve. There are lots of resources available on grief, and some of the ones that I just want to point you to, David Kessler, who is a grief expert, his website is grief.com, and he actually offers a support group every day. And if you go to that website, he is offering a support group. I heard that there was like 5,300 people attending this support group. So you're not alone, that tells you that for sure. But, people are looking for that support. And so I, encourage you to check out that website. Alan Wolfett is a grief expert, the Center for Loss and Grief, and his website can be checked out as well. And also, if you're feeling that you're feeling depressed, or you're feeling like this just isn't getting any better, and you're noticing things like, I can't get out of bed anymore, I'm not showering anymore, I'm overeating or undereating, those can be signs of depression. And we really encourage you to reach out for help. Most counselors throughout the city are offering telehealth options, and just really encourage you to reach out to those supports. Here at College Hill, we have switched to the telehealth option as well, and encourage you to call us here, and we can connect you here or with other counselors, or even if you're listening to this broadcast in other places outside of the Ohio area, feel free to call us, and we can connect you with resources around the country. There's also the crises line here in Cincinnati at 513-281-CARE, and that's a number that can be utilized as well. So there's lots of options out there, so don't hesitate to reach out and ask for the help that you need. We all are going through this together, but we may be experiencing it in different ways. So thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to send those online to us. Thanks for joining us.